The ocean carried sound in a way few men truly understood. Waves rolled in steady patterns, and beneath them the water formed long corridors where noise traveled farther than any sailor expected. In those cold Pacific layers, the Japanese submarine crews learned that every mistake echoed. A single mechanical click, a minor shift in ballast, even the faint rotation of a propeller could reveal their position to ships they could not see. For most of the early war, this gave Japanese submarines confidence. Their captains believed they understood American anti-submarine tactics well enough to evade them. The US Navy used depth charges, but they used them in predictable ways. Patterns were spaced evenly. Charges detonated in simple ladders, shallow, medium, deep. Japanese crews trained to slip between them or drop quickly before the next wave detonated. They believed that survival was possible if they stayed calm, angled the bow correctly, and held steady in the cold below. But by late 1943, the US Navy had begun to study the failures of its early approach. Convoy escorts wanted a pattern that removed the one advantage submarines relied on most: timing. A predictable ladder of explosions allowed experienced crews to anticipate where the next detonation would fall. The Japanese Navy understood the old system so well that some commanders could guess the sequence simply by counting seconds. American sonar operators and ordnance engineers were frustrated. They knew they could detect submarines, but forcing one to the surface was rare. Depth charges shook hulls and rattled bolts, but complete kills were less common than expected. Reports from the Pacific described too many engagements where submarines escaped after a few minutes of silence. It became clear that something had to change. The development teams examined after-action logs and listened to escort crews describe how submarines evaded charges by sliding into the gaps left between blasts. Engineers noted the movement patterns of submarines under pressure. Many captains performed a standard defensive dive, a sharp descent followed by a leveling maneuver just after the first detonation. The Americans realized they needed a pattern that struck not only where the submarine was detected, but also where it would try to go next. This idea produced a new layout. Instead of symmetrical spacing, the pattern became intentionally uneven. Depth charges would fall in a staggered configuration, with certain explosives timed to detonate deeper and wider than previous doctrine had allowed. The pattern looked strange on paper, almost careless, but it was designed with precision. Its purpose was simple: close every escape path a submarine might attempt during the first 10 seconds after detection. Escort commanders were hesitant at first. Traditional patterns gave a sense of order. Ships dropped charges in a neat sequence, and sailors could visualize the blast field easily. But the new model asked them to trust a system that felt irregular. It required a shift in thinking, one that placed the outcome not in uniform spacing but in strategic disruption. The first tests occurred off training grounds near Hawaii. Observers lowered hydrophones into the water and listened as the pattern detonated. The shockwaves overlapped in unpredictable ways. Sound analysts noticed that the acoustic signatures filled the underwater space more effectively. Engineers recorded the data and marked significant improvement in pressure coverage at various depths. Still, this was only theory. What mattered was how the Japanese Navy responded. Word of the new depth charge behavior reached submarine crews only through experience. The first encounters were brief. A Japanese commander would hear the familiar sound of screws above, then the metallic thumps of charges releasing into the sea. What followed, however, was unlike anything they had trained for. Explosions erupted not in an orderly descending rhythm, but in overlapping intervals that made it impossible to predict the next shock. Survivors later described the sensation as bewildering. The submarine shook violently even when it attempted deep dive ease. The normally reliable technique of dropping below the first pattern no longer worked. The charges reached too low too quickly. Some blasts occurred farther out, hitting the outer hull with lateral force instead of direct compression. Crews found themselves trapped in a zone of pressure they did not expect. In Tokyo, naval intelligence collected reports from returning submarines and tried to understand what had changed. Engineers examined damaged hulls and noticed deformation patterns inconsistent with the standard American charge spacing. The blast struck from multiple angles in a way they had not encountered before. Officers assigned to anti-submarine defense scenarios updated their diagrams, trying to model the new American technique, but interception of radio traffic provided no explanation. The Americans were not broadcasting anything unusual. Whatever this change was, it came quietly. What alarmed Japanese commanders most was not just the increased damage, it was how quickly some submarines were forced to the surface. Escorts reported that their sonar operators could fix a solution, drop the new pattern, and observe rising debris within minutes. The number of incomplete kills dropped noticeably. Tactics that once guaranteed escape became unreliable. For the submarine crews, fear shifted from the destroyers overhead to the unseen geometry of the water around them. For the first time in the war, they faced a threat they could neither hear nor anticipate, a pattern that behaved like chaos. The Japanese submarine crews began to notice the change long before their admirals did. It started quietly, as most dangerous patterns do, with small details that didn't fit the familiar rhythm of underwater warfare. These men were experts in listening, calculating, and predicting destruction long before it reached them. For the first time, the sounds that filtered through their steel hulls no longer made sense. They reported that American destroyers were approaching differently. Their engines ran at irregular intervals, with short pauses that made no tactical sense. Their turning circles were wider but somehow more controlled. Even the pressure waves from their propellers felt unusual, pressing against the submarine's hull in ways that suggested a new formation or a new tactic. At first, Japanese captains believed the Americans were simply experimenting. Nothing about the pattern looked threatening. Nothing looked refined. If anything, it appeared sloppy. But the depth charges dropped during these strange approaches behaved with a precision the Japanese did not expect. Instead of rolling off the rails in a steady rhythm, the explosions came in tight clusters, followed by stretches of silence, then a sudden coordinated detonation that hit from 2 or 3 different angles. It was inconsistent. It was irregular. It was exactly the opposite of what American destroyers had done for years. And yet, it was effective. Japanese hydrophone operators were the first to understand that something serious had changed. They began reporting that American destroyers were no longer attacking in straight lines. They weren't circling the same way. Their approach angles blended together, as if several ships were working from a shared pattern designed to catch a submarine inside an invisible cage. These operators noticed that the charges detonated at staggered depths, almost as if the Americans were sweeping the water column from top to bottom. They couldn't explain it, but they could hear it. Submarine captains soon confirmed a chilling reality. Their boats were no longer escaping with predictable maneuvers. The tight left turn that had saved them countless times now placed them directly under the next burst of explosions. The rapid descent to deeper water no longer slipped them beneath the patterns. Even the beloved silent drift, a tactic submariners trusted more than any other, was failing. The Americans somehow knew exactly where to place their charges, and they did so without hesitation. Reports filtered back to Tokyo describing a new American discipline below the surface. It was a strange phrase, especially given that American destroyer crews were already known for their training and coordination. But this was something different. The new pattern felt methodical, deliberate, almost scientific. The Japanese understood they were facing not just a new tactic, but a new way of thinking. Still, the Japanese Navy did not panic. Not yet. They believed the incidents were statistical anomalies. A few submarines caught by bad luck, a few captains outmaneuvered, nothing more. Every navy suffered losses. Every strategy faltered under pressure. They reminded themselves that American depth charges were still limited in range, and that American sonar operators were not yet as refined as their German counterparts. There was no reason to assume the Americans had invented something revolutionary. But the crews at sea knew better. They could feel the pressure waves tighten around them as explosions fell closer and closer in patterns too precise to be accidental. They could tell that the Americans were dropping charges not to scare them away but to kill them. The new pattern was not an experiment. It was a system, one built with intention, and its effectiveness was growing each week. The fear spread quietly at first. Submarine crews whispered about a destroyer group that seemed to predict every evasive turn. Others claimed that some American ships were coordinating their drops so cleanly that the explosions merged into a single continuous ring of pressure. These rumors traveled fast, repeated in mess halls and cramped steel corridors. Even captains who dismissed them could not ignore the rising tension in the voices of their men. By late spring, the reports could no longer be ignored. Japanese submarines were being forced to surface more frequently after attacks, their ballast tanks shaken loose by close detonations. Several boats returned to base with long cracks running along their pressure hulls, damage normally seen only after catastrophic near hits. A few never returned at all. The admirals began to take notice. They compared logs from different flotillas and noticed the same eerie pattern. American destroyers were placing charges with uncanny accuracy. Their depth estimations were improving rapidly. Their formation spacing had changed in a way that suggested a new doctrine. Someone, somewhere in the American fleet, had rewritten the rules of anti-submarine warfare. What the Japanese Navy did not yet understand was that the Americans hadn't simply improved a depth charge attack. They had changed the geometry of the entire process, and soon they would learn that this new pattern, this strange, irregular, unpredictable method, was not merely an evolution of tactics. It was designed to trap submarines in ways no navy had ever attempted. The Japanese could sense this shift, but they still did not know its origin. They didn't know the Americans had discovered something powerful, something mathematical, something almost frightening in its efficiency. They did not know that a single observation made by officers who understood the ocean like a living organism had created a tactic that would reshape the entire underwater battlefield. The panic had not fully set in yet, but the unease was spreading. And beneath the waves, where every vibration carried meaning, the crewmen who heard the first signs of the new pattern understood that a storm was coming, one that no submarine could outmaneuver forever. The first time the new pattern was loaded aboard a destroyer escort, most of the crew didn't even know anything had changed. Depth charges were depth charges, steel cylinders filled with explosives set to detonate at preset depths. They had been dropping them the same way for years. The racks hadn't changed, the charges hadn't changed, the ocean hadn't changed. What the crew didn't know was that the arrangement had changed, quietly, almost invisibly, because the men who designed it believed the old patterns were mathematically predictable. They believed the Japanese sonar crews could interpret the falling geometry faster than the US Navy could scatter it. They believed too many subs were slipping between the predictable gaps. So the new pattern was not a bigger pattern, it was not a louder one, it was not meant to overwhelm the ocean with explosives. Instead, it was meant to confuse the ocean, to hide the real danger inside an arrangement that made no geometric sense to enemy operators who were trying to track the descending sounds. It began with a deliberate asymmetry. Charges were launched from the port rack, but their matching starboard counterparts were delayed, sometimes by fractions of a second, sometimes by full seconds. Roll-off charges entered the water at slightly altered angles, landing in positions that appeared to form loose spirals. The hedgehog projectors were fired at angles that broke the traditional concentric logic of previous attacks. Nothing was evenly spaced. Nothing matched the rhythm the Japanese expected. The result was a sound footprint unlike anything the Japanese Navy had heard before. Their hydrophone operators were trained to detect patterns, clean fall sequences, predictable distances, and the classic crescendo of an attack run. Instead, they now heard a scatter that defied timing. The splashes overlapped irregularly. The metallic descents intersected in ways that sounded like two destroyers attacking at once, even when only one ship was present. Inside the submarines, the first responses were confusion, not fear. Crewmen believed an error had been made, someone miscounted, someone misfired, someone had launched prematurely, but then the pattern repeated on the next attack, and the one after that. What initially sounded like a mistake soon became unmistakable. The Americans were doing this intentionally. The advantage became obvious the first time a sub tried to maneuver out of the formation. The captain ordered a hard turn, intending to slip into the same blind space Japanese submarines had been using for months, but the new pattern didn't leave that space. Instead, the depth charges landed in a widening, unpredictable spread that extended farther than expected. The sub cut into what should have been the safety corridor, only to hear the alarms of charges sinking directly above them. The new spacing wasn't random. It looked random, but it was. It was built on a spacing formula that used the destroyer's own wake turbulence as part of the attack. Turbulence created tracking noise underwater. By staggering the pattern into the turbulence fields, the Americans forced the submarine to navigate through distorted water, which made evasive maneuvers slower and made depth-keeping more difficult. The Japanese found themselves losing precious seconds, correcting depth errors caused not by enemy action, but by the ocean reacting to that new pattern. The first confirmed kill under the new method was almost anticlimactic. The destroyer escort USS Sutton reported hearing a metallic collapse beneath the surface, like steel twisting under pressure, followed by scattered bubbles rising in irregular bursts. The attack had lasted just 20 seconds. The crew did not realize until after the sonar confirmed debris that they had destroyed a submarine that had previously outrun two separate destroyer groups using the old depth charge tactics. Word spread quickly among American escorts, but it spread even faster among the Japanese. Submarine captains reported that the new pattern felt like being hunted by multiple ships at once. They believed the Americans had doubled their escort numbers. Others thought the US had developed a new type of tracking system. They were wrong. The system was old. It was still mechanical, still fallible, still human. But the pattern was new, and for the first time in many months, the Japanese Navy was no longer confident in predicting American behavior. The greatest change, however, came not from the explosives, but from the silence that followed them. Under the old system, after an attack run, the submarine could often determine whether it had escaped by listening for American engines repositioning. But the new pattern forced escorts to maintain bearings longer, knowing the spread would do the work without needing to circle immediately. To Japanese subs, this created an eerie uncertainty. They no longer knew if the Americans were preparing another run or simply waiting for the debris to surface. The fear did not emerge suddenly. It grew mission by mission, each encounter adding a thread to a larger realization. The Americans had stopped fighting predictably. They had stopped following the pattern. They had created a new one designed to dismantle the old logic that Japanese submariners depended on for survival. And in a war where every second underwater mattered, losing predictability was as dangerous as losing air. The Japanese Navy understood this much. If the Americans had found a way to multiply their effectiveness without increasing their fleet, then the ocean itself had become harder to survive. And the pattern that seemed wrong to them was, in truth, exactly what made it right. The destroyers didn't need new weapons. They just needed a new rhythm. The Japanese submarine crews who survived the first encounters with the new American depth charge method reported something that deeply unsettled their commanding officers. It was not simply that the explosions were closer or more violent. It was that they no longer behaved in a predictable arc. For years, the Imperial Navy's underwater doctrine had relied on the belief that American destroyers dropped depth charges in a fixed geometric spread. Japanese navigators studied that spread. They trained to slip away through its gaps, but in late 1943, the sea floor began to shake differently. The explosions came from angles that did not fit the patterns in their manuals. Crews braced for pressure waves from above and ahead, only to feel concussive blasts from below and behind. The change forced the Japanese to confront a truth they had hoped would not come so soon. The Americans had rewritten their attack logic. In Tokyo, staff officers reviewing intercepts and survivor accounts realized that their charts were no longer reliable. Simple diagrams showing escape routes through the conventional American pattern had become dangerously outdated. Boats that attempted the old evasive maneuvers found themselves trapped in the very corridors they believed were safe. The confidence once built on mathematical understanding began to erode. American destroyer captains, meanwhile, noticed the shift in enemy behavior almost immediately. Submarines were surfacing in unexpected places or attempting erratic maneuvers at odd depths, as if reacting to threats they could not visualize. Patrol reports described sudden ascents, uncontrolled turns, and engines pushed close to failure. These were clear signs that the new pattern was exerting psychological pressure as well as mechanical danger. For the Japanese submariners, the most unsettling element was the sense that the Americans were no longer guessing. The old doctrine framed convoy protection as a slow, procedural process, but the new kill pattern felt deliberate, as though each destroyer understood exactly how to collapse the escape space of a submerged target. Crews described the explosions as coming in tight timing clusters, almost like measured steps walking toward them. What unnerved them most was the consistency. No matter the sea state, the time of day, or the size of the attacking formation, the new pattern boxed them in with the same unbroken precision. Reports from U.S. destroyers confirmed that this consistency was intentional. Given the improved sonar resolution, the crews could calculate the likely drift of a submerged contact more accurately than before. Instead of spreading charges in wide arcs, they delivered smaller, denser patterns that followed the projected movement of the submarine. This reduced the chance of wasted ordnance and increased the likelihood of shockwave damage, even without a direct hull strike. Japanese engineers attempted to design countermeasures, but their testing showed that no simple adjustment of speed or depth could reliably evade this updated sequence. The Americans had essentially changed the geometry of the underwater battlefield. Even when a boat evaded the first blasts, the subsequent waves arrived in places that trapped the submarine in a dome of descending pressure. Traditional evasion routines became liabilities, and newer ones had to be invented almost from scratch. Among Japanese officers, a quiet frustration grew. They had invested heavily in speed, range, and torpedo capability, but far less in defensive doctrine. The new American pattern highlighted this gap. Submarines built to attack surface ships now found themselves hunted with escalating efficiency, and there was no easy path to adaptation. Training manuals issued months earlier felt outdated. Crew confidence slipped. Some commanders ordered deeper dives than their boats were rated for, hoping depth alone might deflect the new kill zones. Others attempted silent drift to confuse sonar, but the pattern compensated for that too. The Americans had simplified their method, but that simplification had made it far more dangerous. The Pacific, which once seemed spacious, began to feel smaller to the submarine fleet. They operated with a heightened awareness that a single sonar contact could lead to a coordinated, precise assault from which escape was no longer guaranteed. Even boats that completed patrols without incident returned to base with crews who spoke of unseen pressure, of a sense that they were no longer the silent hunters but the increasingly predictable prey. What the Japanese Navy did not yet know was that this was only the beginning. The Americans were refining the pattern further, feeding more battlefield observations into the evolving method. Destroyers were learning to integrate multiple sonar tracks, adjust timing between ships, and close gaps with mathematical precision that matched the submarine's drift. Each successful engagement provided more data. Each encounter reshaped the next. And soon, word of the new pattern reached Japanese high command in terms they could not ignore. Submarines were disappearing faster, convicting them not through isolated bad luck, but through a systemic shift in how the Americans fought beneath the waves. The old assumptions were no longer valid. The new danger was not just the improved American weapons, but the methodical thought behind how they were used. The change had begun quietly, almost invisibly, but by the time the Japanese Navy fully understood its impact, the underwater balance of power in the Pacific had shifted permanently, and they were now facing a threat defined not by brute force, but by precision. The crews aboard the American destroyers noticed the change before their commanders officially briefed them. Patterns that once required long preparation suddenly flowed with an ease that even veteran sailors found unusual. Depth charges were moved into position faster, firing sequences were coordinated with fewer spoken commands, and the spacing indicators on the racks seemed to match perfectly with what sonar operators were calling out. These were small details, but they were exactly the kind of changes that experienced sailors always sensed first. In the operations rooms, sonar teams worked with a confidence that had not been present in the earlier months. Instead of guessing where the submarine might move, they had a clearer understanding of how the new pattern would box it in. The new arrangement of charges did not rely on compressing the submarine from one direction. It created pressure from multiple sides at once. Every part of the pattern served a purpose. The first sequence forced the submarine to commit to a direction. The second set punished that commitment. The third removed any remaining room for escape. That triangular confinement became the core of the tactic. The Japanese captains who survived the early tests of this pattern described something they had never felt before. Instead of a single wall of pressure, they felt a tightening ring. They heard explosions coming from angles they had not expected, and even when the charges did not strike directly, the shockwaves arrived in uneven, overlapping intervals. These intervals interfered with their attempts to measure distance through passive sound. Submarine crews tried to adjust the trim, slow their descent, and shift laterally, but the incoming detonations created constant turbulence. Their instruments provided readings, but the readings no longer produced clear guidance. American sonar operators observed these results in real time. Submarines that once broke contact quickly were now remaining inside the detection window. Their attempts to slip beneath the thermocline were tracked more consistently, and their efforts to double back into the destroyers' blind zones were countered with more precise turning movements. The new pattern was not only a weapon, it was a guide. It provided the destroyers with predictive insight into how a trapped submarine would move. As destroyers executed the new sequence across the Pacific, the crews became more synchronized. Nobody needed to explain the order of operations. Sailors moved along the rails with practice steps. The firing teams transitioned between salvos smoothly, and the officers monitoring the timing of each drop found themselves making fewer adjustments. The pattern's rhythm emerged so naturally that it began to feel more like a procedure that had existed for years. Radio intercept units listening to Japanese communications noticed a shift as well. Reports from submarine captains included terminology that had not appeared before. They mentioned unpredictable spacing, rotating spread fields, and multi-directional compression. They described the sensation of being driven into a trap rather than forced away from one. Some commanders questioned whether the Americans had developed a new fuse type, while others suspected improved sonar accuracy. Almost none understood that the true advantage came from how the pattern forced predictable movement. When American analysts reviewed these intercepted messages, they recognized the pattern's success immediately. The Japanese Navy did not know exactly what had changed, but it was clear that their captains now treated depth-charge encounters as significantly more dangerous. A growing number even abandoned offensive patrol routes and shifted to more cautious movement patterns. Some began traveling deeper for longer periods, which limited their ability to detect targets and slowed their patrol progress. Others traveled closer to the seabed, an approach that reduced exposure but also increased risk in shallower island regions. The destroyer crews saw these effects reflected in their engagement logs. Submarines were being forced upward or held in restricted zones where the chances of a successful kill were dramatically higher. Even when a submarine survived, the evasive maneuvers required to escape often left it unable to complete its mission. Supply routes that had previously been threatened were now experiencing more consistent safety. Merchant ships that once traveled under constant fear of ambush began reporting cleaner crossings. The pattern's developers, still working from test stations far from the front line, continued experimenting quietly. They adjusted the spacing slightly, shifting one charge forward by only a few feet, but the results were noticeable. That minor change produced a stronger push toward the secondary kill zone. They then altered the depth sequence by a small margin, timing the detonations so that the lower charges triggered just moments after the submarine committed to a descent. These refinements ensured that the pattern did not remain static and predictable. Meanwhile, American destroyer groups communicated their successful encounters in concise after-action reports. The language remained neutral and professional, but beneath the surface the meaning was unmistakable. The pattern worked. It required less fuel expenditure, fewer munitions for long chases, and significantly reduced the time spent tracking any single contact. Commanders with decades of naval experience privately noted that they had never seen such consistency in anti-submarine operations. The Japanese naval headquarters could not ignore the rising losses. They began conducting internal reviews, gathering reports from surviving captains. Many captains insisted they had followed standard evasive protocol. They altered depth, changed heading, cut engines, and attempted silent runs. Yet almost every report ended with the same observation, that the Americans were no longer firing depth charges in a single predictable line. The pressure came from several sides, as if destroyers had coordinated their movements with perfect timing, even when only one destroyer was present. This misunderstanding added to the Japanese Navy's concern. They believed that the Americans had improved their tactical coordination to an unprecedented level. The truth was simpler but far more effective. The new pattern made a single destroyer behave like a formation. Within weeks, word had spread across the Pacific submarine fleet. Crews began referring to the pattern with unofficial, cautious terminology. Some called it the circling pressure, others referred to it as the tightening field. The names varied, but the sentiment was unanimous. This was not the same style of depth charge attack they had trained to counter. American destroyer captains, now fully aware of the fear this tactic produced, continued using the pattern with disciplined consistency. Every crew understood that the goal was not to innovate during combat but to execute the method exactly as designed. Precision mattered. The placement of each charge, the timing between detonations, and the synchronization with sonar tracking had to remain constant. Any deviation weakened the compression effect. As the pattern matured into operational doctrine, its psychological effect became nearly as significant as its physical impact. Submarine crews who once relied on confidence and practiced evasion found themselves reacting more anxiously. Decisions that were once made calmly under pressure now required rapid improvisation. This hesitation often led to mistakes in depth control or course correction. Destroyer crews noted these signs. They observed irregular submarine movements and shifts in the acoustic signature that suggested uncertainty. A submarine that hesitated was easier to track. A submarine that panicked was easier to destroy. By the time the pattern had been deployed widely across the Pacific, American commanders recognized that they had achieved something rare in naval warfare. They had introduced a tactic that not only improved performance but fundamentally altered the enemy's expectations. Submarines that once operated with confidence now entered engagements assuming danger from multiple directions. This transition changed the strategic landscape. Supply routes stabilized. Carrier groups gained more freedom of movement. Merchant shipping lanes that had been under constant threat now saw periods of relative security. The new pattern did not eliminate the submarine threat entirely, but it reduced it to a level that allowed the broader war effort to proceed with fewer disruptions. The fear this tactic generated in the Japanese Navy became part of its power. Sailors spoke about it in quiet tones, unsure of how to counter it. Analysts studied hypothetical diagrams, attempting to identify weaknesses. But the strength of the pattern was that it did not rely on any single component. It worked because of how each part interacted with the others. No matter how closely the Japanese studied it, understanding did not guarantee escape. The Americans had changed anti-submarine warfare not through a new weapon, but through a new idea. A pattern, executed with precision, had become one of the most effective tools of the Pacific campaign.